Now let's look at a more challenging Toyota lock, a late model double throw Toyota door lock. By checking this lock with a pick, we determine that it does indeed have tumblers on both sides of the lock. This means that the key must be impressioned on both sides at the same time. Here's the core out of the lock. We see that it has 4 tumblers on one side and 3 on the other. There are actually 8 tumblers in the system, but the 8th cut is only in the ignition lock. When we insert a key blank into the lock, we have tumblers extending from both sides of the lock. This lock behaves like 2 of our cam locks put together, and we will have to impression both sides of the key at the same time. Here are 2 keys that look quite different, but will both operate the lock. The key on the top has 4 cuts per side and will work if it is inserted properly into the lock. The bottom key has 8 cuts on each side and will work regardless of which direction it is inserted into the door lock. Here's the key that only has 4 cuts per side. This key is very much like the one that we'll get when we impression the lock. It will work just fine if you insert it one way, but if you take it out and insert it the other direction, it will not work at all. Once we have impressioned the key, we will have to transpose the cuts from each side onto the opposite side to have a good working key. Before we begin impressioning, we'll prepare the key blank just as we did with the other locks, except we'll prepare both sides of the key blade. Once we have both sides of the blade prepared, then we'll put a notch in the head of the key on one side only. This gives us an index so that we can always tell which way the key was inserted into the lock. As we work the key in the lock, we need to pay particular attention to the way we're bumping it so that we bind the tumblers and get marks on both sides of the key blank. And here's our key and the marks. We have 4 good marks on the top side of the key as we inserted it into the lock, and 1 on the bottom side. You can only see 3 of the marks in this view, but the 4th mark toward the tip will appear as we rotate the key around in the light. Watch the tip of the key. There, you can see the mark appear all the way out on the tip of the key blade. There is a very similar mark all the way out on the tip of the other side of the key blank. Since we have 4 marks on the top side, we know that there will only be 3 marks on the bottom side, since this is a door lock and there are 4 tumblers on one side and 3 on the other. Here's our key after we've filed it. Notice the spacing. The cut on the bottom side of the key is between the 2 tip cuts on the top side of the key. That's the way it will go all the way along. All of the cuts from one side will be staggered compared to the cuts on the other side of the key. This is typical of this type of lock. And after working the key in the lock, we have 3 real good marks. 2 real strong ones on the top side of the blade and 1 on the bottom side inside our earlier cut. See how these are actually gouges along the edge of the key blade? Watch as they change as we rotate the key in the light. These marks are very easy to see and very typical of wafer tumbler locks. On the opposite side of the key, we have an even larger mark in our tip cut. It is a big gouge on the lower edge of the key blade. It's not unusual at all for your mark to be on just one side of the key blade. Here we rotate it in the light and you can see that it's a very large gouge. After making our cut, it becomes more obvious how the cuts are staggered between each other on the different sides of the key. This becomes more pronounced as we go along. After working the key in the lock, we now have 7 marks on the key. All 7 tumblers are marking. The 4 on the upper side show up as shiny spots on the lower edge of the blade in this view. As we rotate the key around, you'll see the marks come up on the opposite side. We have 2 new marks that show up as rectangular lines across the blade of the key, and a third mark inside our earlier cut that won't become visible until about here. You'll see it show up as a shiny spot right on the edge of the cut. It's actually a gouge on the edge of the cut. Here's the key after we've filed each one of the marks. We now have all 7 cuts showing up on the key. Notice that we're keeping the bottoms of each one of the cuts just as smooth and flat as we possibly can so that the marks will show up better. After working the key in the lock one more time, we have 4 good marks on the key, 2 on each side. On the lower side of the key, as we inserted it into the lock, we have marks in cuts numbers 3 and 4. There is no mark in number 2, and there will be no mark in position number 1 because that tumbler is only found in the ignition lock. But we have 2 good gouges in the 3 and 4 positions on this side of the key. On the other side of the key, we have good marks in cuts numbers 1 and 4. Both of these marks are strong gouges into one side of the key blank. This is very common on this type of lock. Once again, we've filed our key everywhere we have a mark, and you can see better than ever how the cuts are staggered opposite each other on the 2 different sides of the blade. 3 cuts on one side and 4 on the other. After working the key in the lock one more time, we have 2 good marks in cuts numbers 1 and 2. The mark in cut number 1 is a very strong gouge on one edge of the blank. The mark in number 2 is a line that goes all the way across the key on the upslope, the forward slope of the cut. This tells us that our spacing is just slightly off. We'll need to move this cut slightly forward when we file it. As the key turns, you can see the line go across the key blank on the forward slope of the number 2 cut. There you can see the gouge very easily. This shows up very easily as you roll the key in the light. On the other side of the key, we have an equally good mark in the number 1 position. Once again, this is a gouge into the side of the key blank. It's only on one side of the cut. Here's our key after we filed all of the marks. We've moved our number 2 cut on the top side slightly forward because of the position that the mark appeared in. You can see even better now how the cuts are staggered across from each other. When we insert the key into the lock this time, it turns easily. We can now either transpose the cuts from this key onto both sides of another key blank, or we can decode this key and make one from code. Notice that the key does not work at all inserted the wrong way. Only when it's inserted the way we've been working on it will it operate the lock. To finish the job, we'll cut all of the cuts from both sides of our impression key onto each side of a duplicate key. We'll use a key machine for this. You could also decode your impression key and cut a new key from code. First, copy one side onto both sides of the duplicate key. Next, we'll turn our impression key over and copy all of the cuts from the other side onto both sides of the duplicate key once again. We actually cut the duplicate key 4 times, twice on each side. Here are the finished keys. Our impression key is on the right. It has 7 cuts on it, 4 on one side, 3 on the other. Had this been an actual car that we were working on instead of just the door lock, we would have gone ahead and progressed the number 1 cut on the left-hand side of this key to get our missing cut for the ignition lock. The key on the left is our copied key, which has all 7 cuts on both sides.